All right. Hi, comrades. Welcome to the fifth meeting of Liberation School's course on Volume 1 of Marx's Capital. I'm Marisa Sanchez, a PSL member in New York City and a member of the Liberation School's editorial collective. The PSL has been hosting this course because Capital is a book that many activists and organizers want to read, but can often find daunting to do so. And while there are valuable resources for helping work through the text, most of them are from academics who aren't thinking about the day-to-day concerns of organizers in the struggle. So we wanted to do this collective reading from our perspective, the perspective of those committed to advancing the worldwide struggle for socialism and liberation. So just a quick note, in today's class, we'll be covering chapters 10 to 14 of the text. And as a reminder, the pages cited in the slideshow do refer to three different versions. The first is the online version, the second is the international publishers version, and the third is the Penguin version. So with that, I will now go ahead and turn it over to Derek Ford. Derek is a member in Indianapolis of the Party for Socialism and Liberation and is the editor of Liberation School. And then afterwards, I will once again facilitate question and answer. All right, Derek, thank you.
Thanks, Marisa, and welcome, comrades, to Class 5 of Capital. Volume 1, we'll be discussing chapters 10 through 14, moving from the working day to relative surplus value, and in the process, discovering when the capitalist mode of production really comes into its own being. So to begin, we'll do a little bit of review just for some concepts that we'll be revisiting. So the first is that capital in this book is divided between constant and variable capital, and constant capital is the means of production, machinery, tools, the raw materials, the auxiliary materials like energy inputs, and it's constant because the value in constant capital is the result of previous socially necessary labor time required for its production. And in the production process, when it's deployed, its value is just transferred to the new commodity or service, whatever it may be. Variable capital is labor power, right? And this is variable in two senses. One is that it adds new value in the production process. And two is that it varies as a result of different factors like the degree of intensity of production, the organization of production, those kinds of things. And then the working day itself, we've seen, is divided between necessary and surplus labor time. The former is when the worker is reproducing their wage, right? And so this is really variable capital. And surplus labor time is the time during which the worker produces new value for the capitalist. And the rate of surplus value is surplus labor time over necessary labor. Right? And this is a rate, so they both glide into each other. The value of labor power is the socially necessary labor time required for the production and reproduction of the worker, and this is determined largely through class struggle. So education, training, housing, domestic work, reproductive labor, food, drink, all these things go into this. And there's a contradiction between the exchange value and the use value of labor power, which is what a lot of the discussion in the working day hinges upon. And further, the value of labor power takes the form of a bundle of commodities necessary for the production and reproduction of labor power. And these can be sort of determined at various levels of society. So for example, depending on the cost of living, the cost of education in a particular city, location, industry. So chapter 10, as we know, the working day is composed of two parts, and there are limits to the working day, right? So the first is that there's only 24 hours in a day, right? And there's only so many hours that one can work without being prevented from or disabled from returning to work the next day. And the other is that there are moral or social limits, right? So workers need also to satisfy intellectual and social wants, and these will vary based on the state of the class struggle. So the working day has to be less than a day, but how much less and how is this determined? And it's really determined through struggle, through class struggle, the struggle between capital and labor. And to set this up, Marx gives us basically a fictional discussion between the capitalist and the worker when they are exchanging labor power. And so the capitalist, from the capitalist standpoint, the capitalist says, well, I paid for your use value, right? And so therefore I should determine how to use it. And according to the laws of exchange, capital as a buyer of commodity wants to get the maximum use out of it and is entitled to that, right? In the same way that when I buy an iPhone, Apple can't really tell me exactly how to use it. And if it does, then there will be sort of a legal or political struggles that unfold as a result of that. The worker, on the other hand, says, okay, yeah, you bought my exchange value, you bought my use value, but my use value produces value. That's why you bought it. And it's located in my body. So you see sort of a spontaneous expression of or increase in value, but for me, that means I'm expending more labor power, right? And this is going to impact my body, my life, my social relations, and all of this. So labor power, as we know, is a unique commodity because not only does it produce value, but it's embodied in actual people, which Marx calls this living labor. And so the way that labor power is consumed is something that not only impacts the worker, but the worker, according really to laws of exchange, also should have a right to say like how long they sell it for, right? The conditions under which they sell it for. And this is the distinction between the exchange value and the use value of labor power, because the exchange value of labor power is determined before the use value is consumed, right? So there's the temporal difference. And it's not just a struggle over the length of the working day, but also like the organization of the working day, as we'll see. Am I making 10 shirts an hour or am I making 100 shirts an hour? Am I teaching 20 students in a class or am I teaching 200 students in a class, right? This will be a different consumption of the use value of my labor power. And so there is a contradiction here that can't be solved within the framework of the law of exchanges, right? Marx says at the bottom here, there's therefore an antinomy, right against right, both equally bearing the seal of the law of exchanges. Between equal rights, force decides. So the conclusion is that the length of the working day is ultimately determined by class struggle, right? At various levels, from strikes to slowdown, stoppages, sabotage, and other means, political legislation. And this is one reason why Marxists speak of political economy, because you can't understand this basic economic conception of surplus value without understanding politics and the fact that it's not determined just by supply and demand, but through class struggle. We also see that there are laws or really tendencies of capitalism. We've seen Marx emphasize again and again that these operate behind our backs or over our heads in ways that are beyond our control as individuals, but these tendencies aren't deterministic or mechanistic, right? Because struggle plays a key role. So then Marx tells us that surplus labor isn't unique to capital, just surplus labor power, right? Any society sort of requires surplus labor so that it can prepare for droughts or bad seasons, pandemics, for example. But it's really the surplus labor power as a commodity, as a value that's unique to capitalism. And once capital enters the picture, the lust for surplus labor knows no bounds, right? And this is, again, the contradiction between exchange value and use value, right? And the limitlessness of exchange value. Because if a community is just requires surplus labor to make it through, particular circumstances in a limited setting, there is a limit to how much needs to be produced. But under capitalism, when exchange value dominates, there is no limit to that. And capital entering the picture and transforming this impacts other modes of production, right? So Marx notes that as soon as production that's still in slavery, corvée labor, are drawn into the international market dominated by the capitalist mode of production, the sale of their products for export becoming the principal interest, the civilized horrors of overwork are grafted on the barbaric horrors of slavery. Hence, the slave labor in the southern states of the American Union preserved something of a patriarchal character so long as production was chiefly directed to immediate local consumption. But in proportion as the export of cotton became of vital interest to these states, the overworking of the slave and sometimes the using up of his life in 7 years of labor became a factor in a calculated and calculating system, right? So Marx talks about the civilized horrors of overwork under slavery, so definitely not romanticizing them, but those horrors are exacerbated when capital enters the picture and when the slave owner is producing not just for the local market, but for the international market of capital, whose interests are exchange value that are potentially limitless. So, and it's the same thing with the corvée system, in which peasants had to work for free for the state, for the landlords, or for others. But once it became inaugurated into the capitalist, international capitalist system, this too was transformed. And so what we see here is that capital sort of subjecting other modes of production to its rule and to its logic, right? And we can also see here what Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, which is capital's tendency to insert itself into every nook and cranny of the globe. And this expansion is not just when there's something external that's added to capitalism, it's when capitalism, because of its own internal dynamics, sort of expands into something and then transforms that production process. So the lengthening of the working day is the expression, the positive expression of greed for surplus labor. And then he moves into the English Factory Acts to limit the working day, which are negative expressions of the same greed. And this is important, so let's read this. That these acts curb the passion of capital for a limitless draining of labor power by forcibly limiting the working day by state regulations made by a state that is ruled by capitalist and landlord. Apart from the working class movement that daily grew more threatening, the limiting of factory labor was dictated by the same necessity which spread guano over the English fields. The same blind eagerness for plunder that in the one case exhausted the soil had in the other torn up by the roots the living force of the nation. Periodical epidemics speak on this point as clearly as a diminishing military standard in Germany and France. So there's a couple of things here. I mean, first, Marx is talking about the nature of the state. This is really the first introduction of the state and capital. And he's telling us that the state really is managing different sets of contradictions or conflicts, right? On the one hand, there is the intra-class conflict of the capitalists, because it's in the interest of the individual capitalist to accumulate as much value as possible, as quickly as possible, even if that means overworking the working class to death, right? But that can run up against the collective interests of capital, because the individual greed of the capitalist, if there's no limitations on it, can lead to the collapse of the system. Because, for example, there could be no more labor power to exploit, or there could be so much less labor power that workers are able to gain the upper hand in the class struggle and demand more of the profits, right? So the state has to manage that contradiction. And we see that today in the pandemic, right? Where it's in the interest of individual capitalists to run down the health of workers, but then it might be in the interest of collective capital to actually make concessions to the working class so that the system as a whole can be preserved, right? And this is what happened. This is one of the things that happened with the New Deal after the Great Depression. And we see it also at work when, really rich ruling class people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett talk about higher taxes on the rich. They're basically making an argument that it's against my individual interests as a capitalist, but it's in my interest as a member of the collective capitalist class, right? And so this is strategically important because in terms of, figuring out the balance of forces in the class struggle at any moment, the contradiction between individual and collective capital can be a pressure point that the struggle can sort of attack, right? And on the other hand, the state is managing the contradiction between capital and labor. And it's also, as we see here, managing the contradiction between capitalist and landlord. And Marx is writing about landlords here because, one, landlords were in a dominant force in the English state, particularly in the first half of the 19th century. And there was a fierce struggle between the capitalists and the landlords. And this struggle included the working class and included the class struggle, and it also included the state. This is one of the few mentions of landlords in volume 1. Most of that is in volume 3 when Marx discusses rent. So Marx then goes to the factory inspectors, right, and talks about the conditions they describe. And they're talking about appalling conditions and overwork, right? So death, railway accidents caused by, conductors being forced to work so long that they fall asleep. We see this today in transportation, especially in trucking. Capitalists are willing to risk violating the acts because they can make more money doing so than the fines or penalties that are imposed on them for doing so, right? Children are especially mistreated for greed of employers and also parents, right? They're treated as auxiliary material, like energy inputs. And so we see here how the notion of the family in English society is also transformed by capitalist production relations, right? It's not a separate sphere, it's something that's intimately connected to it because parents were selling their children to the bosses. We see small thefts of time, the weird arrangements of workers' hours. Marx, there's a werewolf-like hunger for surplus value. We see, for example, the adulteration of bread, so putting chalk in bread, which would reduce the value of bread, and because bread factors into the value of labor power, it would drive down the value of labor power, and so therefore it would reduce the constant capital or the variable capital that the capitalist had to put out, right? And we see current examples of this. Some that people have mentioned on the previous discussions are, Amazon workers having to urinate in cups in their vans, stealing breaks happens all the time. Of course, wage theft too. And Marx, it's interesting, that Marx is quoting very favorably from the factory inspectors who were really agents of the capitalist state or the capitalist and landlord state, and they can be really useful for the class struggle. They're kind of testimony. They also can reveal the function of the state as an entity that, manages inter- and intra-class conflicts and how they can support one group of the ruling class against another, right? So factory inspectors came about because of campaigns by workers and landlords. The workers obviously had a vested interest in it, but the landlords wanted to make the capitalists look bad because there was a struggle happening at the time, right? So if they could sort of sully or dirty the image of the capitalists for the legislature, then they could retain, a more dominant position in the class struggle as it unfolded. They also show why capitalists can be really hostile to the state, right? Because even though it's a capitalist state, the state isn't totally uniform, and it has to also respond to the contradictions between capital and labor. And the state itself, right, has a lot of contradictions. We see, I think the first mention of formal subjection is translated as subsumption in the Penguin edition. We'll talk about the significance of this. I think it is quite significant later on. But the main thing here is that when capital first approaches an industry or a sphere of production, it takes it and it's indifferent to the technical character of the labor process, right? So it doesn't radically transform the labor process. It actually just sort of extends the working day, for example, right? Or increases overwork. Marx writes about the relay system and multiple shifts. And basically, based on what we've read so far, one, the capitalist wants to appropriate surplus value 24 hours a day. and they can't work the same workers 24 hours a day. So they create like 3 shifts, right? Morning, day, and night shifts. And the capitalist also wants to use the means of production before the value decreases, right? Before somebody else creates a new piece of technology that will reduce the value of the commodities that the capitalist is producing at that time, right? So basically it's like, all right, fine, workers need sleep. Well, we're going to find other workers to take their place while they sleep. And then Marx notes that it would seem that the interest of capital itself points in the direction of a normal working day, right? And this is one, because capital needs labor power. And if it's worn out faster, surplus value will increase, but you'll need to produce more labor power. And there also needs to be a restraint on the werewolf hunger for surplus value, right? In order to manage the contradictions between collective and individual capitalists. And we also can see why capital at this point in the book needs an excess supply of labor power, which is so that it doesn't have to care if it overworks workers to death, because there will always be a ready supply available, right? And we'll talk more about this when we get to chapter 24 in particular. So what was the struggle for a normal working day like, right? It didn't depend on the goodwill of the individual capitalist, because competition brings out the inherent laws of capitalist production in the shape of external coercive laws having power over every individual capitalist. The capitalists might, want to treat the workers really well, but if, and pay them more and have them work less because they're, good people, or they are, as he says, I think, members of for the Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. But in order to remain a capitalist, they have to remain competitive. And so it's really beyond their individual choices, right? Marx also says that it's the centuries of class struggle, right? And sometimes the legislation shortens the working day. That's what he's concerned with. But in other times, it lengthens the working day, and this is especially in its infancy, and we'll discuss this more in part 8 of the book. But, the lengthening of the working day occurs in capitalism. Marx notes the first one in 1348, the first legislation lengthening the working day, and there's several reasons for this, right? I mean, one is that people don't want to work in the factories under capitalist conditions, because they can survive from other means, from the land, or from begging or stealing or black markets or whatever. They don't want to accept the factory conditions or the capitalist work discipline, right? It's a radical transformation from working the field, even though it's still an exploitative relationship relative to the feudal lord, than it is working in a factory under a capitalist, right? In terms of, well, we'll get into some of this a bit later. And the other thing is that sometimes they can get paid for working 5 days enough to work 7 days, right? So this is also when there will be like a lowering of the minimum wage, for example, so workers have to work more. And there's a footnote here that Marx notes the role that Protestantism plays in this by changing almost all of the traditional holidays into work days. So he notes here the poor law commissioners that would send poor people from the fields into the cities, and he writes about the role that ideology plays in this with Protestantism, right? And this explains the importance of the superstructural, or the cultural, the social elements in capitalist production. It's not just an economic system, it's also a social system, it's a cultural system. And so, Protestantism, by sort of tying one's value to their productive expenditure, helps deepen and expand and legitimate the capitalist mode of production, right? And so in the story here so far, capitalists are still the minority class compared to the landlords, and there's a struggle between capitalists and landlords, and between capitalism and feudalism. And we noted in the last class why capital sort of theoretically had the upper hand, because it isn't tied to land in the same way that feudalism is tied to land, right? So shortening the working day, this is what Marx is concerned with. He takes us through a series of factory acts beginning in 1802 and ending, I think the last one is in 1853. And the first factory act is in 1833, and it's the result of working class resistance, and at times alliances with the bourgeoisie. part of this had to do with the working class leadership making a deal with the capitalists in order to increase bourgeois representation in the English Parliament. Because of the way it was structured, land ownership was so important to representation. And so the idea was that there would be sort of universal suffrage as a result of this. But there was no enforcement. And of course, the bourgeoisie totally betrayed the working class movement. In 1846 to 7, there are crucial, they're important for capitalism in England. One is the repeal of the Corn Laws and taxes on cotton. Corn laws, or wheat laws, were tariffs on imported wheat, which kept English landlords wealthy because they didn't have to compete with others, right? So they could sort of set the price in accordance with their value, their socially necessary labor time. They didn't have to match it against the socially necessary labor time of other countries. And capitalists campaigned against this because it would hurt the landlords, right? And also because bread goes into the production and reproduction of the worker. And so if you can have access to cheaper bread, cheaper wheat, you can reduce the value of labor power and therefore reduce the necessary labor time portion of the working day. The Chartist movement, working class movement, and the 10-hour struggle reaches an apex. The 10-hour workday has passed on May 1st, 1848, but there was a vicious counter-reaction to it. The Chartist leaders were imprisoned, which sort of really debilitated, demoralized the working class movement. They banned meetings, arrested the leadership, outlawed literature, and increased the sort of the policing of the movement. And the June 1848 insurrection was suppressed, and it united, Marx says, all these various elements of the ruling class, right? And even the church, because basically concessions could be granted up until a point. And at some point, the contradiction between capital and labor becomes more important than the contradictions between the capitalists and the landlords and the church. The church is also, of course, a big owner of land at this time. And then also sort of other ideological trends that, may be pulled toward the working class direction at one point and away from it at another, in terms of those who, priests and free thinkers, right? Government opposition. And as a result, there was a counter-revolution. Marx calls it a pro-slavery rebellion, where the manufacturers no longer restrained themselves, right? They broke out in open revolt against the whole of legislation since 1833. It was a pro-slavery rebellion in miniature, carried on for over 2 years with a cynical recklessness, a terrorist energy, all the cheaper because the capitalists risked nothing except the skin of his hands. And of course, the skin of his hands is his workers. Right. The Factory Act of 1850, completed in 1853, more or less settled the 10-hour day. And so Marx documents some of the ways that the capitalist class did this without necessarily like violating the laws, right? But finding loopholes. So like, okay, we're required to have workers, give workers time to eat. Well, we're just going to give them their meal time the hour before they start work, right? Children can't be employed. Okay, well, who defines childhood? And there are intense struggles at this moment over the definition of childhood. And in many ways, in the late 19th century is when our modern notion of childhood really comes into being, precisely over this, right? What constitutes childhood? Should childhood be a time of, education and, some relative limited notion of freedom, or should it be a time when you work, right? And these are struggles that continue today. We see them play out in the legal system in particular, where there's different laws in different states even for what, when children are allowed to give consent to different things, for example. And, we see this today over struggles, for example, around, okay, I can join the military at age 18, but I can't buy cigarettes or alcohol until 21. So, really, where is this definition? And so I think that the point here is that our conception and therefore sort of reality of childhood is also transformed by the capitalist mode of production and the class struggle. And in this last section, Marx consolidates his findings into two parts. And I think there's really sort of a dialectic at work here, right? So first, there's the sort of unlimited werewolf-like hunger for surplus value. And it's changing social relations, the production process. It gives rise to an extravagance beyond all bounds. And then in opposition to this, right, there's a sort of push for the legal limitation of the working day. And second, the history of the regulation of the working day in certain branches of production prove conclusively that the isolated laborer, the laborer's free vendor of his labor power, when capitalist production has once attained a certain stage, succumbs without any power of resistance, right? The creation of a normal working day is therefore the product of a protracted civil war, more or less dissembled between the capitalist class and the working class. So not between the individual capitalist and worker, but between the collective capitalist and the collective worker, right? So this resistance in turn requires organization because individual workers don't stand a chance. And Marx also talks about slavery and the workers' movement here, right? And notes that, and this is a famous quote, you probably heard this, or many of you have probably heard this, that, you know, so long as slavery exists in the United States, the workers there are paralyzed, right? Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, wherein the black it is branded. But out of the death of slavery, a new life at once arose. The first fruit of the Civil War was the 8 hours agitation. So, you know, as long as there's slave labor, and there's basically like a radical racial division between different sources of labor producing for capital, now that slavery has been transformed as a result of capitalism, that division really, I mean, disadvantages both slave laborers and also wage laborers. So there needs to be, and this is why Marx gave so much sort of attention, both in his writing about the Civil War and slavery, and also in his agitation, because, you know, at one point the British government was going to intervene in the Civil War because cotton was such an important source of industrial production, capitalist production, and if there was going to be sort of, you know, less cotton or more expensive cotton, it would have hindered production, capitalist production, the production of surplus value in England. And at the time, Britain had the largest, you know, navy in the world, and so their intervention really could have been quite significant, right, in terms of altering the course of the trajectory, maybe even the outcome of the war. And so Marx and the working class in England agitated and organized against that military intervention. So, you know, we see that the actions, the anti-imperialist organizing, anti-colonialist organizing that was happening in the colonizing country was, you know, part of the struggle in the colonized territory, right? And the struggle by the colonized people and by the enslaved people. And at the end, Marx argues that workers have to put their heads together and as a class compel the passing of a law, an all-powerful social barrier that shall prevent the workers from selling by voluntary contract with capital themselves and their families into slavery and death. In the place of the pompous catalog of the inalienable rights of man comes the modest Magna Carta of a legally limited working day. So the working class needs to struggle for reforms that will be implemented by the capitalist state, and they won't be perfect. And as we've seen, the capitalists will try to push back on them, to cheat them collectively and individually. But it's interesting because after noting that, you know, all the horrors of industrial life, you know, in some ways you could say that this conclusion is a little mild, right? But keep it in mind, because this is a reform proposal, but it's not the only proposal that we'll see in the book. And particularly in chapter 32, where Marx is talking about revolution, I want to revisit this so that we can talk about the way that Marx is thinking in this book about reform and revolution as, you know, dialectically related, not as just antagonistic, right? There are antagonisms between them, but it's not just antagonism, right? It's not an antagonism where one necessarily precludes the other. So now we'll move on to the rate and mass of surplus value. So we know the rate of surplus value is the rate of exploitation. The mass of surplus value is basically the rate of surplus value times the overall number of workers, right? And there's limits to this. Capitalists can only employ so many workers. There's the length of the working day, and there's the quantity of the means of production and raw materials that capitalists can acquire, right? Can set in motion. And we see another mention of formal subjection, right? The capital subordinates labor on the basis of the technical conditions in which it historically finds it. It does not, therefore, change immediately the mode of production. So capitalist production, when it's producing surplus value, what Marx will next call absolute surplus value, it isn't yet really a proper mode of production in itself. It's not standing on its own 2 feet. Surplus value that's produced by lengthening the working day can't explain capitalism as a mode of production. And so in chapter 12, he gets more into this and tells us what the other form of surplus value is. So absolute surplus value is produced by lengthening the working day, right, as variable capital remains constant. So in this first example, right, A to B is necessary labor time, B to C is surplus labor time, and you can see that in figure 2, when you lengthen the working day, you lengthen surplus labor time and therefore surplus value. Relative surplus value comes from reducing necessary labor time or variable capital, right? So in figure 2, necessary labor time is shortened and therefore surplus labor time is expanded, even though in both instances the working day is the same, right? So what's interesting here is that, or one of the things that's interesting here is that relative surplus value, which is when the capitalist mode of production comes to stand on its own, is the result of this class struggle, right? And the way that it plays out, and the limiting of the working day, at which point capital has to find other sources of surplus value. And this chapter is also getting us ready for the ways in which this is produced, which takes place over the next, I think, 3 chapters. So there's 2 interrelated forms of relative surplus value. First, it happens on a permanent and general level by cheapening the value and price of commodities to factor into labor power, right? So whenever a capitalist, reduces the value of shirts that factor into the value of labor power, they'll cheapen the value of labor power, right? And Marx notes this can also happen through state intervention, right? The abolition of the corn laws did this. It can also happen through rent control, subsidizing housing, healthcare, education, lowering the minimum wage or paying workers less in the value of their labor power. But remember, in this book, Marx is trying to get at the internal operations of capital. So he's going to sort of exclude these from consideration and ask how this happens as a result of the internal laws, in particular the external coercive laws of capitalist production, external to the individual capitalist, of course, but internal to the capitalist system. So the other way it happens, which is what Marx is really interested in, is on an individual level through the difference between individual value and social or real value. So we know that value is socially necessary labor time, which is an average, right? So assume that socially necessary labor time required for commodity X is 2 hours, right? But if I come up with a technology that can reduce it to 1 hour, then the social value is still really 2 hours, but the individual value is 1 hour. So I can sell it. I mean, I can try to sell it still at the value of 2 hours, right? But because now the value embedded in each of my commodities is less, to realize that value, I need to sell more of them. And so as a result, I'm going to sell my commodities below their social value, but above their individual value. And therefore, I'm going to be able to capture more of the mass of surplus value that's available, which has a whole set of contradictions, right? I mean, it leads to overproduction because all the capitalists are trying to shorten necessary labor time. And when they shorten necessary labor time, they decrease the value of the individual commodities. So they have to sell more of them, which leads to more and more commodities until at some point there's a glut. There's also then an overall decrease in value, right? I develop a source of relative surplus value, but my competitors do the same, right? Because they have to remain competitive. And so at some point, the socially necessary labor time required for commodity X falls from 2 to 1. So there's less value embedded in each commodity. And the overall value of the commodity is decreased. This relates also to the falling rate of profit, which we'll talk about a little bit more in chapter 15 and 24 and 25. Marx also notes that the means of production don't produce surplus value, which we know they're constant capital, but they can be a source of relative surplus value, right? For the individual capitalist, they're a source of relative surplus value. The other thing is that the value and price of labor power can fall, but workers might also be able to buy more commodities with the same wage or even a lower wage, because if the commodities cost less, but my wage is the same, I can buy more of them. All right, and so the first way in which relative surplus value can be produced is cooperation. And again, capital finds cooperation already existing, right? And this is a starting point of capitalist production, right? A number of workers working together at the same time in one place, right, to produce a commodity under the command of the capitalists. And so this is the formal subjection, and it's a quantitative distinction, right? But then capital takes command over it and reconfigures it, and quantity becomes quality. So as cooperation increases, right, even without changing the working system itself, just by bringing in more laborers, there's a revolution in the material conditions of the labor process, right? So you need bigger and different warehouses, transportation systems, technologies, and also demands for supervision and discipline. So there's a couple of ways that cooperation increases production. So one is that when the means of production are consumed in common rather than isolation, the rate at which the value of constant capital is transferred to a single commodity decreases, even as the exchange value of constant capital remains the same. There's an increase in productivity of an individual, right? So the individual working together with others is themselves sort of, more compelled to work or whatever, right? There's conditions there. There's something that happens there when humans are working with others. Although again, this is a tendency, right? It's not like a deterministic law. And there's importantly the creation of a new power, the collective power of the masses, or the collective worker, right? So one of the things capital does with cooperation is it increasingly subjects it to scientific sort of command, right? And the study of it, which will really intensify in the early 20th century. And this eliminates gaps in production processes. It decreases waste, it increases speed, and it increases ability. So labor becomes omnipresent. So here we see that labor is really occupying every pore of that production process. And then Marx notes that when the laborer cooperates systematically, right, which by means according to a plan, in this instance the capitalist plan, they strip off the fetters of their individuality and develop the capabilities of their species. So this is one way in which capitalism creates their own grave diggers, because the individual worker is powerless against capital, but not the collective worker, right? And capital is what produces the collective worker, which is what is able to contest and ultimately overthrow capital. And then we see that the formal subjection, right, that can lay the basis for the real subjection of the labor process under capitalism, which we'll talk more about later on, in particular in chapter 15 in our next class. And again, we see that, when workers come together to cooperate, their productivity increases, but so too does their resistance to the domination of capital, right? And with this, the necessity for capital to overcome this resistance by counter-pressure. And interestingly, in a footnote here, Marx notes that a Philistine paper looked at cooperation in the workplace, and it was like, well, like it's good for capital, but the problem is that like it basically shows that workers don't need the capitalists because they're the ones who are cooperating to produce this stuff, right? So there's another way in which capital creates its own grave diggers. And so all of this increases the need for directing, superintending, and adjusting workplace, right? Which becomes one of the functions of capital. So there's a new sort of class of workers, he calls them a special class, that are under the command of the capitalist, because capital, like a real army, requires officers, managers, surgeons, foremen, overlookers, who, while the work is being done, command in the name of the capitalist. it's an established and exclusive function. It's a special kind of wage labor because it's a wage labor, but it's one in which the worker is maybe at times closer to the capitalist than to their fellow workers. And the other thing is that the power of cooperation is uncompensated and fetishized because this power, it doesn't cost capital anything, but it looks like capital is the source of it, right? Because capital is the one that brought all the workers together, right? All right, and so then we go to chapter 14, the division of labor and manufacture. So manufacture is like an intermediate stage between handicraft production and industrial production based on machinery, right? And manufacture, it comes out of handicraft production in two ways. Basically, the capitalist brings together different handicrafts to make one commodity or employs a number of handicrafts people to produce the same thing. Right? The first is heterogeneous, the second is serial. The first is heterogeneous because there's different processes happening, and the second is serial because there's a bunch of workers who are working on the same process in a serial fashion, right? Like kind of an assembly line in which one commodity is the final result, right? Well, that's actually true in the first case also. An assembly line in which what was formerly the work of one handicraftsman is divided up into different handicraftsmen. The division of labor is intensified. And the thing about manufacture and handicraft production is that it relies on the skill of the worker, right? So the productive capacity is embedded in the use value, in particular concrete use values of the worker. Right? It's not inherent in capital. Capital doesn't own it in the same way that it does when it develops machinery. And this also implements a revolution in the means of production, the instruments of labor. Right? So Marx talks about how, like, you know, in Birmingham alone, there's 500 varieties of hammers that are produced for different processes and different parts of the same process. And the worker becomes specialized as a result of the division of labor. Right, and is reduced to the repetition of the same act rather than engaging in all of the different processes to create one commodity. They're just doing one thing over and over again, right? So that this is a process of alienating the worker from their own capabilities and their own skill. The other thing is that when you're doing the same thing over and over again, right, you can figure out a way to exert less energy doing it and be just as productive or more productive, right? And that this is another way in which the sort of productivity of capital is really the productivity of the worker. It's just, it looks to us like it's capital. And manufacture reorganizes space and time, right? So it brings workers together in the same space, decreases the time between one stage of production and another, which is another productive power. But manufacture still divides labor into isolated stages, right? So it needs to transport one article from another, from one process to another, and this is a disadvantage. Right? In the same way that the fact that the worker's skill is still important is a disadvantage because it inhibits capital's total control over the production process. And then Marx writes about the difference between the division of labor and manufacture in society and how capital transforms both. So, you know, the division of labor in manufacture is when different workers are doing different things in the production process. And the division of labor in society is when different people are producing different things in the entire sort of social organism of society. And so within society, the division of labor basically is intensified in both places, right? But there's different effects. So in society, there's a dispersion amongst independent producers of commodities, and it's open to chance manufacture. There's a concentration of means of production with the capitalists, but in manufacture, it's a concentration of the means of production, not independent workers. And then Marx notes that, you know, the same bourgeois mind, which praises division of labor in the workshop, and their complete subjection to capital, opposes with equal vigor every attempt to control and regulate the process of production as a whole, right? And so basically he's pointing out the contradiction that, like, okay, you say that, like, cooperation, organization there should be planning in the workplace. But why is it that we say that there should be planning in production in all of society? That's all of a sudden an encroachment on the rights of property freedom, right, and unrestricted play of the capitalist, right? So it is very characteristic that the enthusiastic apologists of the factory system have nothing more damning to urge against than a general organization of the labor of society, than that it would turn all society into one immense factory. So we see again the process of quantity into quality, where manufacture seizes on handicraft production and revolutionizes it, right? It converts the laborer into a monstrosity by forcing the detailed dexterity at expense of the world of productive capabilities and instincts. So that the general overall artisan skill of the handicrafts person is reduced, right? They're alienated from that, and they're made to perform the same task over and over again. But this in turn creates the collective labor, right? And through the collective labor, capital, rich in social power, productive power. Each laborer must be made poor in individual productive powers, right? And at a given stage in its development, this narrow technical basis on which manufacture rested came into conflict with the requirements of production that were created by manufacture itself. So manufacture reorganized society, introduced or intensified the division of labor into the workplace, and intensified in society, but it couldn't shake the core of production, right? So the final product of manufacture is what we're going to get at next class, which is the production of the instruments of labor themselves, especially the complicated mechanical apparatus then already employed. The workshop, the product of the division of labor and manufacture, produce in turn machines. And it is machines that sweep away the handicraftsman work as a regulating principle of social production. And this is when real subjection or subsumption takes place, right? Is when the skill and the productive capacity is transferred from the individual worker to the machine, right? And therefore capital's command over labor power is all the more intensified. So we see here a contradiction between the productive forces and the productive relations, right? Where the productive forces lag behind productive relations, which help bring about a new revolution in the means of production, which is machinery. So we'll end there for now. For next class, read chapter 15. It's long, but it's really good and interesting. And I'll draw your attention in particular to the 4th footnote in the chapter. If you're reading the Penguin book edition, it's the 2nd footnote on the 2nd page of the chapter. In the Penguin edition and in the online edition, it is the 4th footnote. And we'll talk about that at the beginning of next class. But thank you so much, comrades. If you have any questions, email me, and we'll stay after, of course, to discuss any that you have right now.